Okay, welcome to All Things Aging. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most popular topics in our work, which is when our parents move to town.
Yes, I'm experiencing this currently. So this is a great timely topic to talk about today.
So a lot of times families want, especially when younger kids are involved and grandchildren are born, they want their parents to move closer for many reasons. And a lot of times parents do move closer. Talk a little bit first about why people would want their parents to move closer or the parents would want to.
Right. So I think there are several reasons that older adults might relocate to be near adult children is certainly one of them, like you said. And so a lot of times if the older parents are retired and say I'm having children, then they may relocate to help with childcare. This is particularly the case if there is a single parent and the parents are stepping in or the grandparents are stepping in order to help provide childcare. Other reasons that somebody might choose to relocate would be if the parents themselves are getting older and they may need more support from the adult child. A lot of times as somebody gets older, they sort of want to reconnect with family. And so that sense of connectivity could also be a reason that parents would decide to relocate. Another common one is climate. If you think about it, as you get older, you might not want to be out there shoveling snow all winter. And so a lot of times you'll see people retire to more mild climates because they just want to relocate someplace where it's more kind of mild year round versus having a more extreme season. So those are just some of the reasons that somebody might choose to relocate and specifically closer to older adult children.
So let me ask you, in your experience, when people relocate to be closer to adult children, is it usually the older adults' desire to do that, or is it the kids asking them to come?
I would say it's definitely a mix of both. In the cases of childcare, it might be the older adult asking the parent to move closer. Another common one that happens is there could be changes in health, right? So mom or dad has a health problem that comes up and I'm the one who's helping them manage it. Then I might want mom or dad to move closer to me because I'm also working. I'm in that sandwich generation raising kids. And so it makes it much easier in that case if the older adult relocates closer to the adult child so that I can help manage whatever those changes are in health.
So that brings up a good point, which is that's one of the benefits of having your parents move closer. What are some other benefits?
So it's definitely easier to help somebody if they're in a community that you know how to navigate the resources, right? So I do this for a living. I should be able to help my parents wherever they are. But to be honest, I have the connections in the community I live in to the healthcare providers, to the other support systems. And so having them, the benefit of having them move closer is that it's going to be easier for me to navigate that. I would have to spend less time and money traveling to go help them, especially if I'm still raising kids and working. One of the other benefits, even if it's not a childcare scenario, is that the grandparent is now getting to spend more time with the grandchildren. And there's a lot of research out there that talks about the benefit to grandchildren of having a grandparent present in their life. And so that's it goes back to that sense of connectivity. But there's definitely a benefit there between that grandparent and grandchild relationship as well.
I can't tell you how often as a therapist, when I'm talking to people about their childhood, how often they bring up their grandparents as sources of stability and love, like that really unconditional love where they felt like somebody had time to really spend with them.
You hear people say all the time, I'm a better grandparent than I was a parent. So clearly that next generation gets the benefit sometimes, but just closer relationships in general. And there's some stressors that come with relocation as well. It's always hoped the benefits outweigh those, but there's certainly some challenges that could come with that scenario as well.
So what are some of the, I guess, unexpected challenges or stressors?
Let's go back to the scenario of childcare. If you have a parent who's relocating closer to you to help with childcare, it's really important to establish some boundaries because I may parent differently than my mother would parent. And so it can be really challenging to navigate what role that grandparent is going to play in childcare, what the boundaries are, how I might discipline my kids. There's lots of sort of topics that can come up that can create a challenge if you don't discuss those things ahead of time. Really good communication on the front end, because really important. The other topic that comes up is where mom and dad are going to live, right? So if they're relocating, are they anticipating living in my home? Are they anticipating living down the street? Like, where are they physically going to live in proximity to where I am? It's another great topic that needs to be discussed ahead of time so that it doesn't become, an issue, because people could have different perceptions of what this new relationship is going to be like with parents moving to town.
And what do you see as, I guess, the biggest disappointments or conflicts that come out of that?
Well, I think it's shifting roles, right? So if grandma and grandpa come to town and they have this idea in their head that there's going to be weekly dinners every week and they're going to spend all this time with the grandkids, and then they show up and I'm busy with work and I'm doing things with my friends, and maybe the kids are busy too, and they're not getting the quality time that they anticipated, then there can definitely be some hurt feelings. And so discussing those family dynamics ahead of time, those boundaries, and, how often are we going to get together now that we're neighbors, or now that you're living just down the street? Maybe you set up a weekly family dinner, but it's not every night. And so those can be challenges to navigate to make sure everyone's expectations are in alignment.
I imagine too that with parents moving close by, things might come up that you didn't understand, like maybe mom's health issues are more drastic or dramatic than she let on, or she needs more help or whatever.
Right.
And how do you, because much like we talked about in the retirement segment, you can have the best plan and then the reality sometimes is different. So how would you suggest, or I guess, how have you seen people navigate that successfully?
Right. So, if you haven't spent a whole lot of time around mom or dad, and it's been sort of a long distance relationship, and then suddenly they've relocated, they're either in your home or they're in a home close by, there may be things, maybe you thought mom and dad were really doing great and really independent and really active, and you soon learn that that's not the case. Like you said, maybe there's some health issues you weren't aware of, and maybe there's some cognitive changes that you weren't aware of, that now that you're around, mom or dad every day, you start to notice that maybe, they're not as sharp as they once were, or that maybe short-term memory is starting to fail. And so that can really be a challenge, because at what point do you address that? Right. With the parent. And I think one of the most difficult situations I've had over the years and complications was a family we worked with. The mom and dad moved to town, and they were going to help with childcare, and they were going to be picking the kids up from school and taking them to sports. But it turns out that when they got here, that there were some real cognitive issues with dad, and there were some real issues behind the wheel. And so there had to be some really hard conversations about not driving the grandchildren. And so in that case, that family, it was a real fracture between them, because it hadn't been talked about ahead of time. There were, obviously health and cognitive issues that family wasn't aware of. And so that's something that definitely, as you're closer in proximity and you're in each other's everyday lives, there may be things like that come up. And then you have to sit down and have some challenging family conversations.
I imagine too that for grandparents who are coming to take care of grandchildren, it briefs well. It sounds good. I'm going to watch them 8 hours a day. We're going to have so much fun. And then it's exhausting and overwhelming, and they can't get to their doctor's appointments or do the things that they have also wanted to do. And they might feel guilty to say to the parents, hey, this is too much for me.
Right. It could be exhausting. And if I'm really depending on, my mother as my, primary backup support, and she's really struggling with what that's taking out of her, and it doesn't meet expectations, it can be a problem. Hopefully my mom doesn't listen to this, but another sort of funny experience that I had recently is, and this was just, my parents are in the process of relocating here. So they've been coming to stay with us while they're looking at houses. And the extra bedroom upstairs in my house has a Jack and Jill bathroom with my 17-year-old son. And so my son made a comment to me after they left that grandma's peeking in his room in the middle of the night when she gets up to go to the bathroom to make sure he's not on his phone or on his computer. But he was a little upset because he said, I can't sleep because I'll fall asleep and then I see grandma peeking through the door. And so there can be unexpected, things like that. They're just an adjustment for everyone involved. So the teenager or the children, as well as the grandparent. So it really is sort of a shift in roles and those family conversations to have on the front end. And then as something comes up, right? Like
Right.
not letting it fester,
Mhm.
fester, and become a big issue when you could have had, a little ground rule or a boundary or a conversation that would have made that issue kind of go away.
When you bring up a good point about the grandchildren, like they can feel smothered, or it can be different for them in a way that they didn't have any voice or agency
Right.
in. So how do you see that show up? And what would be your advice for including the grandchildren in this decision?
So I think just like you said, include the grandchildren in the decision. It certainly impacts their life as well. And typically, grandparents are very well-meaning. They have this desire to reconnect with the grandchildren. And I think that's easier when the children are younger. I think as the children get older and they're driving and they have their own lives, it can be a little bit of a challenge because, if we're expecting family dinners, but my child's at sports every night or working or with his friends, then that expectation's not met. And so I think making sure that the grandchildren are in on some of those conversations, especially age appropriate and as they get older. But again, setting up, hey, your grandparents live in town now. They'd really love to be able to see you once a week. Could you guys set up, a breakfast or a lunch or something so that everybody's expectations are met?
And what specific discussions would you suggest having as not just as people are coming, but before the travel and the changes happen? What are the key conversations you think are important to have?
I think it all, again, comes back to managing those expectations. And my sister lives in another state. And so we've been having these conversations because, I'm the one where parents are relocating. And so she realizes that I will have more of the responsibility as they get older. And so I think that happens in families, right? If parents are picking one place to relocate and there's multiple siblings, one adult child may end up taking on more responsibility. And so those conversations extend beyond my household, my parents, but also with my siblings and other people in the family. And so I think on the front end, having sort of a family discussion on mom and dad or mom or dad have chosen to relocate. Here's where they're going to be. Here's, what support they're going to need, and talk not just about in the moment, but what's the plan a year from now? What's the plan 5 years from now? If mom suddenly needs care, where is that going to happen? Is it going to happen in my house? Am I going to go to her house? Am I not going to provide hands-on care at all? And we're going to look at some type of supplemental care in the home or a facility. So talking about not only the immediate of the move and the relocation, but talking about what that might look like a few years down the road and who's going to provide that support.
Have you ever seen complications with multiple adult children and where the parents should move? Have you ever seen conflict in that? Yeah.
Yes. And I've seen, now we had this one family and there were 3 adult siblings and each of them agreed to take mom for a year. But what they weren't thinking about was the impact on mom having to move 3 different places. So some things, like you said, sound really good in theory or on paper, but in practice, that doesn't really work. But if there are siblings, or even more complicated, or when there's been second marriages and there's siblings from different families, it can get really sticky because if you have multiple people who have different ideas about where, mom or dad should live as they get older, it can cause family rifts. And so communication, I think, is always the key to that. But getting people to sit down and communicate, as you know, as a counselor, can be easier said than done.
How long would you say the process generally takes from the time that there's the discussion of, hey, you guys might want to move out and be closer to the grandkids, or we can help navigate a healthcare issue with you, to when the parents move?
I think that's a great question. I think ideally a year gives you great lead time. And I know in my parents' situation, not only do they have to sell their home and pack up and declutter. These are all great topics for future podcasts. And sort of downsize. They also have to, find where they're going to live here and then coordinate making that move. So, if you have the time to plan, a year gives you really good lead time to do that. But in reality, if somebody has a crisis, it could be happening quickly, right? If somebody has a fall or a new diagnosis, or they're actively dealing with a health crisis or a financial crisis, sometimes those moves have to happen quickly. And obviously there's more challenges that can happen in those circumstances.
And that crisis could be with the adult child, a divorce or something like that, where the parents have to move immediately. instead of a year.
100%. It could be with the grandchild. It could be with the adult child. It could be with the adult parent. Yeah, a crisis can cause things to shift quickly, and it could be support coming from either or both, depending on what the circumstances are.
So I think it's important to have the conversation long before the crisis happens. I know we can't tell when a crisis is going to happen,
Right.
but if you start having this conversation early on,
Right.
even like soft versions of it,
Yep.
then it's not such a shock to the system.
Yeah, I mean, when you're in crisis is the hardest time to plan. And even again, going back to my situation, my parents, they're living in the home they built for their retirement home.
Right.
Their plan was to stay there, but circumstances change. And I think if you've at least had some conversations ahead of time, you can change with those changing circumstances and make that transition easier overall for everybody involved.
Well, and I think too, remaining flexible, my mom moved 3 times into different homes closer and closer and closer to my siblings. It was like she didn't want to get too close.
1 state away,
right, and
2 hours away,
2 hours away,
in your
and
backyard.
And now she lives 20 minutes away. And as her husband recently passed away, and my sisters have been there to help her with finances. They go over every week and look at her bills. And my mom's really independent, and she can see the grandkids whenever she wants. But being close by really helps my sisters, who are busy
Definitely.
with kids and work and all that, provide the support my mom needs, and my mom's able to be fully part of their lives.
Yeah, if you think of family dynamics 100 years ago, right? Most families for generations lived in the same physical proximity, whether it was on a farm or wherever they were. Most families, there were multiple generations right there. And so as somebody got older and circumstances changed, people cared for each other.
Right.
But you take today, when you could have, adult children living in 3 different states and mom in another state, it's just changed the dynamics of aging in general. And so then we get on topics like this of relocating to be close to an older adult child. So I think it's one of those topics we'll probably talk about many times in many different aspects. And certainly I'll share my experience as we go through this as well.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing and for offering a different perspective. All right.